I think we can start now. Thank you all for joining. So just before starting our conversation, I would like to present shortly the Human Technology Foundation. The Human Technology Foundation, created in 2012, is a foundation, but also a research and action network, placing the human being at the heart of technology development. So the foundation's main missions are, first and foremost, to be a coordinator of international multidisciplinary research projects. The Human Technology Foundation is also an interface between academics, civil society, and the economy, just like today. And finally, it is also a provider of expertise for decision makers. So the Human Technology Foundation network has several thousands of members and operates in Paris, Montreal, San Francisco, Rome, Brussels, and Geneva. So why do we address today the issue of crypto asset regulation? Crypto assets are a genuine revolution, greatly facilitating payments, adding transparency, and cutting out middlemen. And so, given all these benefits, we wish to understand which tools the public authorities will create to monitor this new industry, which is still unregulated, and what will be the consequences of these tools. Indeed, many of our partners have voiced some concerns about finding the right balance between protecting the consumer and letting crypto players thrive. So, given this context, we think that a comparison between two major projects, be it the European one and the American one, can help us better understand the terms of the debates and highlight the stakes for each market. So on the one hand, we have in the European Union, we have a focus on protecting the consumer, as shown by the latest version of the MiCA text, which is the market in crypto assets regulation, which is currently in a trilogue phase between the European Commission, the Parliament, and the Council. And this text highlighted a certain number of issues, amongst which there was the energy consumption, and some MEPs even included a ban in a former version of the text, of course, a ban on crypto assets using the proof of work consensus, for instance. In the United States, President Biden issued an executive order on March 9 entitled Ensuring Responsible Development of Digital Assets, and its objectives are to lead and shape financial innovation so that it can promote prosperity, prevent abuse, and advance democratic values. So this executive orders demands that half a dozen agencies and executive office are tasked with studying DLT technologies and the effects of these technologies. So they are asked to produce reports on these issues. And the executive order also covers themes that the MiCA text in Europe does not answer. For example, the possibility of a central bank digital currency project. And interestingly enough, some executive in the European Union, such as Commissioner McGuinness, put forth the idea that the European Union and the US should be working together and have a joint crypto playbook to offer a framework at a global level. So when Commissioner McGuinness told this, she put 4 requirements for a regulation. So that first, no crypto products should remain unregulated. Second, that supervisors should collect and exchange information globally. Third, that any agreement must protect retail investors. And last, that the crypto ecosystem should fully integrate environmental considerations. So we see that this common project would set the European Union and the US as leaders and take the regulation to a global level. And to talk about all the issues involved in these regulatory projects, I am pleased to have with us Faustine Fleuret, who is the president and CEO of ADAN. So ADAN is the French Association for Development of Crypto Assets. ADAN's vocation is to promote crypto assets and blockchain technologies in France and Europe in the service of a new, free, and open economy. We also have Lee Reiners, who is the executive director of Duke Law School's Global Financial Markets Center. At Duke Law, Lee Reiners teaches fintech law and policy, and his research agenda focuses on how new financial technologies fit within existing regulatory frameworks. And last, we have Hubert de Vauplane with us, who co-leads the alternative investment management practice in the Paris office of Premier Levin, an international law firm. Hubert de Vauplane provides legal counsel on fintech, blockchain, and cryptocurrency assets. He is also a professor of international banking and financial law at the Paris Institute of Political Sciences, Sciences Po IEP Paris. So I will now let them tell us more precisely what they think about today's topic and their feelings about the current regulatory projects. Please feel free to ask all your questions in the chat directly. We will go through them at the end of the presentation. Thank you for your attention, and Faustine, the stage is yours.
Thank you very much, Joseph, and hi everyone. Really happy to speak about this really hot topic right now in Europe. Yeah, as you said, ADAN is a professional body. We are promoting the development of French and European industry of crypto assets, an industry that would be strong and competitive enough at the international stage. First of all, I must remind that regulation is key to help the industry structure and grow and to help good actors differentiate from bad actors, if I said it really simply, and to have standards and rules that promote the adoption by consumers of those new use cases. So regulation is key. We need regulation to structure this industry. It is key because it helps protect consumer, it helps stability of markets, and it should help, and that's the question, innovation to develop. But those goals, it means that we need a balance between all those goals. And that's the question at the in the current EU debates that we are raising. We have, with the MiCA, with the transfer funds review, a strong focus on protecting users on the AML-CFT objectives. But it's less sure, it's less obvious that we are trying to help the innovation develop, and that we are trying because we are adapting a regulation that we inspire from the traditional one to those technological opportunities, and that we found this regulation on the technological advantages of blockchain technologies and crypto assets. So that's the technical part, I would say, that it's maybe missing, but also on the economic part, we must wonder if MiCA and TFR are really helping to develop an industry that can keep competitive with other key regions in the world, meaning that we have protection, but we do not go too far, and that we are not too strong on those rules, meaning that we can have people to regulate and people to supervise in Europe. So I think we'll go deeper in maybe the technical details of this regulation, but that's, I would say, my introduction regarding the EU regulations.
Thank you very much for this introduction. Lee, maybe you can continue and maybe give us a few details about the executive order that is happening on the American side of the Atlantic.
Sure, happy to. So, I think there was a lot of rhetoric leading up to the executive order around what it was going to contain. And folks in the crypto industry were very concerned because one of the things that you kept hearing in the media was that the Biden administration was set to crack down on cryptocurrency. And when the executive order came out, I think the industry was pleasantly surprised because the order was a complete 180 from a crypto crackdown. It was an explicit acknowledgement by the administration that digital assets are here to stay, and they're not going away, and that it should be the policy of the United States government to embrace the beneficial aspects of digital assets and innovation while trying to control for the risk. Now, I would stop short of calling that a national strategy. Presumably, you would say that about any type of new technology. You want to harness the benefits while controlling for the risk. And as you said, Joseph, it now falls on essentially every agency in the federal government to look at blockchain and digital assets from their statutory mandate to see what rules or regulations may need to change. There's some specifics in there as well around a central bank digital currency. I think the executive order was very optimistic about the potential for a central bank digital currency to promote financial inclusion, more so than what you've been hearing coming from the Federal Reserve. So right now we're very much kind of in this holding pattern where we're waiting to see what these agencies come up with in these reports. But I'll note that they have limited authority. And in fact, I would argue that they've already sort of pushed their legal authority to the max when it comes to digital asset regulation. And so for there to be any meaningful changes to how crypto and digital assets are regulated in the US, it's gonna have to come from Congress, because we have a very fragmented regulatory system in the US. I think many listeners know. No one would design the system we have from scratch. It's a byproduct of historical accident, a political accident. And a perfect case in point is that, the US is one of the few countries that has a separate derivatives regulator, the Commodity Futures Trading Commission, and a securities regulator, the Securities and Exchange Commission. And that has been really problematic and confusing when it comes to who has oversight over digital assets. So the CFTC has said that Bitcoin and Ether, and by extension, most other cryptocurrencies that look like them, are commodities. So they're not securities, and various courts in the US have upheld that. Now, of course, there are some cryptocurrencies and digital assets that are securities, and generally these are ones that are led by kind of a central group, right? There's the, not to get too far into the weeds in terms of the Howey test and what's an investment contract, but basically, is there an investment of money with an expectation of profit, and that profit is derived from the efforts of others. And so you really look at, okay, how decentralized, or conversely, how centralized are some of these crypto projects? And if they're centralized, then in fact, they probably are securities. So when it comes to commodities, though, commodity tokens like Bitcoin and Ether, commodity spot markets are not regulated by the CFTC. So what that means in practice is that the largest cryptocurrency exchanges in the US, like Coinbase, Gemini, and Kraken, are not supervised at the federal level because all they're listing on their platform are technically commodities. And to me and a lot of other people, that is a big gap in the regulatory environment for digital assets, and one that I think all parties recognize need to change. The question is, which agency should be given authority to police crypto spot markets, and what should the extent of their authority be? Now, there are many in the crypto industry, including Coinbase, who's put out a proposal arguing for the creation of a self-regulatory organization, essentially allow the industry to police itself. And of course, there's precedent for this in the financial sector. Notably, broker-dealers in the US are overseen by FINRA, the Financial Institutions Regulatory Authority. Now, there are others who argue, including Sam Bankman-Fried at FTX, who argue that the CFTC should be given crypto spot market authority because they're already overseeing cryptocurrency derivatives dating back to 2017 with the introduction of Bitcoin cash settled futures contracts. The CFTC has overseen cryptocurrency derivatives, and the derivatives market for crypto has only grown since then. And then there are others, including myself, who say that the Securities and Exchange Commission should be the agency given crypto spot market authority because of their expertise, their resources, and most importantly, they have an investor protection mandate. At the core, that is what the Securities and Exchange Commission does, unlike the CFTC, which does not have an investor protection mandate. And so I think, again, this is something that really needs to change because none of the rules around market integrity, manipulation, all those things that, traditional securities exchanges like the NASDAQ or the New York Stock Exchange have to comply with, they don't apply when it comes to crypto exchanges in the US. And so, my fear is that, ordinary investors will get hurt before we see meaningful reform.
Thank you very much for this introduction. And of course, we will speak more about consumer protection and see in both projects how this notion is taken into account. Maybe, Hubert, can you finish this introduction round by giving your feelings about these products?
Yes, thank you. Thank you again. Which is interesting to see is potentially the difference of approach between the US and the EU in regulation of those crypto assets. Regulation is not substantive law, in the meaning that the way of the MiCA is to propose a regulation of the structuration of the market and its intermediaries. MiCA will not discuss on the substance of the law, even though MiCA is proposing a definition of crypto assets. This definition is merely, as it is the case, is a lot of EU regulation or directive, is merely to define the scope of the text, but not the substance itself. And then, this is my first comment. I will have two comments only. My first comment is what we have done, even though it is under discussion in the EU, is more or less to duplicate from another directive, the so-called MiFID for financial instruments, the organization of the future digital asset market to this market, i.e. we have copy and pasted more or less the MiFID regulation and adapted to the digital assets, which is interesting in terms of methodology, because here we come to more or less the issue discussed with Lee, is who is the right authority in the US, and for us is who is or what is the right benchmark, if I may, to regulate this activity. Is it something like a security or like a financial instrument, even though it is not legally speaking a security or a financial instrument, but in terms of methodology, does it make sense to duplicate the organization of the financial market to the digital assets, which seems to be the case in the EU, or is it something totally different? This is my first comment in terms of methodology, whether or not it is a good idea to duplicate the organization from the financial market from the MiFID to the digital assets. Second comment is on the substance. A regulation is a regulation. A regulation is not in the EU sense, but a regulation in the legal sense, if I may. A regulation is not the substance of the law. Then we come to the substance. What does it mean? What is a digital assets? And here we have an interesting proposal from Unidroit. For the lawyers, I suppose that they know what is Unidroit. And Unidroit is an international based convention or organization based in Roma, in Italy. And Unidroit is proposing some principles of the substance of the digital assets, as Unidroit did, for instance, for intermediated securities with the Geneva Convention in 2009, but it was a convention. Here, Unidroit is proposing principles, not convention, but principle on the substance of digital assets, which is interesting because it is a global proposal from the US, from Asia, from Europe, from Africa, concerning what are the core principles and the substance of a digital assets. Here we are not talking about regulation, but law, which is a difference. And I think the two aspects are needed. This is my two comments.
Well, thank you for these introductions. Indeed, there's a big issue regarding definitions. And so I think maybe a first starting point for our conversation would be to see if both projects have the same definitions of the different terms of the debate. And maybe for people listening to us, the easiest one to understand is the definition of consumer protection. So it has been well highlighted in the European project. Maybe could you share your thoughts about if you see differences in consumer protection from the European perspective compared to the American one. As you wish, for the first person to answer.
I can maybe try to introduce the debate in the EU. When we talk about consumer protection, we have to define what kind of protection for the consumer, in the meaning that you maybe know for European, but maybe for non-European, that we have some directives from the EU concerning the consumer protection, but they are not the same if we are talking about financial or non-financial activities. Let's take an example. In the consumer protection, we have the possibility for a consumer to withdraw its buying 15 days after the acquisition. Okay, it is an example of a quite very common consumer protection on the e-commerce, on the e-market, on the e-platform. Does it work for digital assets? But the question is, does the digital asset have the same meaning that those kind of goods or services? And the answer is no. Okay, what is a digital asset? Is it a financial instrument? In this sense, we don't have this 15 days protection. We have no protection at all for this specific aspect. But just to illustrate what I am saying is, on the top of that, we need to define what is a digital asset to see whether or not this digital asset fall within the definition of goods or services, or fall within the definition of not financial instrument, but something which is like a financial instrument. And then we come to my previous point. Does it make sense to duplicate? And the answer is potentially yes, for this point at least, to duplicate the system of protection for consumer coming from the MiFID and all financial instrument to digital assets, or does it make sense to duplicate from the goods and services consumer protection rules?
Yeah, maybe I can offer a U.S. perspective. So, when the Dodd-Frank legislation was passed in the wake of the global financial crisis, it consolidated all responsibility for enforcing consumer finance protection within the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, the CFPB. But it's important to note that the CFPB does not have authority or oversight over securities markets. So when we're talking about digital assets, in terms of are they securities and are they commodities, the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau in the U.S. doesn't really factor in. In the U.S. in the securities context, we have a disclosure-based regime, and Europe does as well, pretty much. So it doesn't really matter how awful a business idea it is. If you're issuing securities, as long as you're accurately disclosing the risk associated with that investment, you're allowed to issue securities, and anyone is allowed to invest in those securities. So there's no, suitability requirements. And I think that is something that I believe MiCA and Hubert can address it better than I can. I believe is imposing on some of these crypto exchanges, which is a suitability requirement. But by and large, that doesn't apply here in the US. And so, it's interesting when you think about, okay, what does disclosure look like in the digital asset context? I think that is kind of where maybe there's room to get creative from a legal and policy perspective, especially when it comes to so-called decentralized finance or DeFi, because when there's no, again, central party, right, or legal entity that is the issuer, if it is just a smart contract, right, or a decentralized autonomous organization, who is responsible for disclosure, and what does that disclosure look like? And so, there's a variety of ideas out there, but none have crystallized. And I think that's something that MiCA is grappling with as well, because there's a requirement that cryptocurrency issuers release a white paper But in the context of truly decentralized coins, who is responsible for that white paper? And of course, what should be the contents of the white paper, which is, that's to come later. So, there's some really interesting kind of legal and technical questions around what does disclosure look like in a truly digital and decentralized environment.
Okay, and maybe to go further, from an industry point of view, Faustine, do you think that the definition of the legislator regarding consumer protection, regarding investor protection, is it too harsh? Is it setting too much constraints on the players of the industry, and that is a burden for them?
I think that there are several topics, but if we must start from definitions, meaning from the scope, and I think, and that's what Hubert said, not all crypto assets are financial instruments. MiCA is designed for financial activities on crypto assets. That's the right regulatory vehicle to supervise those financial use cases through crypto assets. So this means that we should regulate only financial use cases, and that not all crypto assets can be assimilated to financial use cases. And we have on this point one question regarding the scope of MiCA, because there is an intention to extend the scope to nearly all crypto assets, including, for example, non-fungible tokens, because the assumption is that non-fungible tokens are an homogeneous asset class, and that the activities on those NFTs should be supervised under MiCA. And that's where we have some confusion sometimes between functional technological concepts and legal concepts. And the NFT case is a great illustration. We cannot assume that all NFTs are the same assets. You have NFTs that can represent an artwork, a football card, an element in a supply chain, and all those assets are really different from others. So we cannot assume as well that MiCA is the right and sole regulatory texts that apply to the NFT universe that is really multiple, really diverse. So when speaking about the definitions of crypto assets, if we are in the context of this regulation, we should really take care that the scope is the right one. Otherwise, we could finally include use cases that have nothing to do with a financial regulation. So that would be my additional comment on definitions. But your question was a bit broader regarding the constraints on the industry. As I said, regulation is key to help the industry structure, but it means that this regulation must be both adapted and proportionate. And that's a good question. Is MiCA, is TFR adapted and proportionate? Why proportionate? Because, and especially in Europe, the innovation, the crypto assets, new use cases are built by newcomers first. Of course, we have already some financial institutions and non-pure crypto players that are interested in crypto and leading some projects. But the vast majority of the crypto industry is constituted by newcomers. We made a study to try to draw the profile of this industry, and what we understood is that most of those companies are very young. More than 80% are less than 5 years old. Teams are less than 10 people for the vast majority, and they face the difficulties that young structures face when they want to develop regarding bancarization, regarding funding. So if we want to regulate such a young industry, we need to be proportionate, because we can't assume that this sector, those companies can comply with rules that are designed for really old financial institutions, really old banks that could structure without this level of burden. It was really more progressive at the beginning, more flexible, I would say. And that's something that in the current debates, we do not really take into account. That's why we need a proportionate regulation, but we are not really sure at this time that it's the case. And adapted, it's why an adapted regulation? It's because we cannot assume also that crypto asset markets runs like financial markets, and that they are all financial use cases as I said. So that's the first point. But on the other side, we should see the opportunity of those technologies to rationalize, to optimize the regulation of those markets. We have really transparent markets. We can build new tools that are really helpful in regulation and supervision. For example, the analytical transactional tools, the decentralized identity tools too. But at this stage, we do not rely upon those new opportunities. But that's a real pity, because it would be the best in terms of regulation and to be efficient for the objectives that we are targeting. We were talking about investor protection, about AML CFT. And if we want to apply a regulation that is not adapted to those companies and that do not use this opportunity, at the end, we miss the objective of those regulations. And that's something that we are not sure that in the current debates, it's I think it's a huge work and a long-term work. And to the contrary, those debates are really fast and want to achieve in the next weeks or months maximum. And that's why we are really afraid that we cannot find the right balance for something that is for a framework that is more adapted and proportionate. If the methodology is to be the fastest as possible to find a text, but at the end that is not the right one and the one that we need.
If I may, Joseph, to comment on Faustine's comment, and maybe Lee will have its own view about the US, is what Faustine was saying is more or less to come back to a core principle of the EU regulation, which is so-called same activity, same rule, which is quite new. Few years ago, maybe, I don't know if it is few years ago, but some years ago, don't know if it is 10, 15 or 20 years ago, the idea of having the same rule for the same activity was not so strong. And here, this is the issue, because, and we can illustrate, for instance, with the draft regulation on the pilot regime, which is part of the future EU regulation concerning the digital package, where at the end, newcomers, in fact, fintech, have no possibility to benefit of this new regulation, which waive from part of the existing regulation, because the existing regulation is not adapted for the DLT and for the blockchain. And the idea was not to put all people in the same line, but to get benefit or to get advantage, more exactly, to existing people, existing institutions, those who are today regulated, to benefit of this activity, of this new activity. And then we go to the methodology, which is in the EU, the same activity, same rule is in fact blocking the entrance for newcomers. Even though we need to have some rules and strong rules for newcomers, but as Faustine said, it is quite difficult for an entity with 10, 15, including to 100 people, to be in the same line, in the same page, in the same organization that the big one on the financial industry, including on the credit institutions. And here, this is a question of methodology. And I'd like to know what happens in the US. Lee, do you have the same rule, i.e., having the same activity, you must comply with all rules, i.e., we don't have some sandbox or some categorization depending on the weight or on the fact you are a newcomer. How does it work in the US concerning a new activity? Is it the standard for all the same standard for all people, or do you distinguish between people?
No, I mean, it's, broadly speaking, and Alexandra's right in the chat here, that the U.S. does have the same risk, same activity, same regulation principle, and the executive order upheld that. Another way to think of that is, regulation should be technology neutral. So, frankly, I don't think it's the regulator's job to promote any specific type of innovation. It's the private sector who's the one that innovates. To the extent that policymakers want Congress or want regulators to embrace innovation, promote innovation, then that falls on Congress to, enshrine that in legislation. But listen, there are some, back to kind of definitions, there are some definitional gray areas when it comes to these digital assets that allow it to evade this, same risk, same regulation principle. So I think a classic case in point is stablecoins, right? And so, there are a number of risks associated with stablecoins. One of which that policymakers in the US and elsewhere have expressed is the potential for a traditional bank run, whereby holders of a stablecoin begin to doubt and question the value of the assets in reserve that are backing that stablecoin, that are maintaining that peg. And should they have those concerns, then they might trigger a run where they sell the stablecoin issuer then has to sell assets out of their reserves in a declining environment, and it's a fire sale dynamic. And I think people get the gist. Well, when it comes to banks, deposit taking institutions, the way that we've addressed that risk in the U.S. is through things like deposit insurance, access to central bank lender of last resort facilities, and of course, traditional bank supervision. None of which, for the most part, apply in the stablecoin context. So here you have, again, a great example of same risk, but not same regulation. So it certainly is a principle that policymakers do try to adhere to, but the way statutes are worded right now, it's allowing this parity to go fall to the wayside a little bit. And so I think this is something, again, that policymakers are very actively addressing. Now, I'll add a little editorial here a bit because, frankly, I push back on this notion that this is something that, crypto is something that policymakers should be embracing anyway. One of the things you hear quite frequently from people in the industry is that, this is innovation. And we need to embrace innovation. And if we don't embrace innovation, then the innovation is go to some other country. And implicit in those statements is a value judgment that innovation is always and at all times a good thing. But of course, the definition of innovation is value neutral, right? It doesn't necessarily always have to be a good thing. And I argue that Instagram for kids, for example, is technically innovative, but I think we can all agree from a societal standpoint, it's not a good thing. So, when you look at digital assets and how they're used to facilitate ransomware attacks and undermine our economic security, to bypass sanctions and undermine our national security, to effectively gamble on assets that have no inherent worth, thereby undermining our financial stability. These are all very clear costs, and I'm not quite clear what the benefits we get in return are. So, I would push back a little bit that this is an innovation that's even worth embracing. As I'm putting it a little more mildly than what Warren Buffett and Charlie Munger said over the weekend.
Okay, very clear. So maybe you think that the stage of the current project in the US is a bit late compared to the one in Europe, because all the risks you mentioned are one that are pretty clear in the legislators' mind. So maybe Faustine or Hubert could after say if it's true that these risks are so present. But do you think that maybe the American project has been a bit delayed given the size and the importance of the actors and what they're doing right now?
Yeah, I mean, I wouldn't even characterize it as a project, because that implies that there's some type of, coordinated, effort. It's a bit like the kind of the blind men and the elephant, right? Where they're each touching it and they're, observing it from what they feel, but no one can understand that it's an elephant. Again, we have a very fragmented regulatory system. And when it comes to, digital assets, it's regulated as money by the Financial Crimes Enforcement Network, which is within the U.S. Treasury. It's, essentially the U.S. Financial Intelligence Unit. So that means, crypto exchanges have to register with FinCEN and file suspicious activity reports and have an AML program. Money transmission in the U.S. is also licensed at the state level. So again, an exchange like Coinbase is going to have a license to operate in essentially all 50 states. Then you have, as I mentioned earlier, in some cases, cryptocurrency is considered a commodity. And if there's a derivative on that crypto, then it's regulated by the CFTC. In other cases, it's regulated by the Securities and Exchange Commission. It's considered property for purposes of tax. So you have to pay capital gains, either short or long term, for any cryptocurrency transaction. And then you have states doing various things as well. And in the US, we have this phrase where states are the laboratory of democracy. And you're certainly seeing that play out right now in the digital asset context. So there's no, cohesion here at all in what regulators are doing. And this is why I think it falls on Congress to provide some clarity. But I think, as many of you know, we have a fairly dysfunctional Congress right now. It's politicized. This is an election year. And I just don't think this is an issue that's very high on many people's priority list. And so, I'm a bit of a pessimist at this point, as someone who sees very clear risk associated with digital assets, as I just said. The history of regulation, if we take the long view, is that it's imposed generally after some type of crisis, right? The Great Depression ushered in the securities laws and the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation. And then, of course, the global financial crisis ushered in Dodd-Frank. So I don't see why we would expect anything different this time around. I mean, I think it's going to really take the proverbial widows and orphans to get hurt by a crypto collapse before you see Congress take any meaningful action. So I think the digital asset industry is really getting their way right now, because the status quo, frankly, benefits them by providing these sort of legal gray areas in which they can operate and continue to grow.
And just to give an example, could you maybe show us what are the differences between the two states that show that there's really no, there's no text covering the same way, same assets?
Yeah, I mean, I think, the best example is New York. And so, as folks might know, New York in 2015 became the first and thus far only state to develop a unique licensing regime specifically for cryptocurrency businesses, and it's known as the BIT license. And the BIT license was and is very controversial within the crypto community. And in fact, recently the new mayor of New York City, Eric Adams, has called on the New York State Legislature to repeal the BIT license, because he's convinced that it hinders New York City's competitiveness when it comes to digital assets. And so, the BIT license imposes some pretty unique requirements, specifically around cybersecurity when it comes to these, digital asset platforms. Now you can contrast that with a state like Wyoming, which, policymakers there have said that their goal is to turn Wyoming into the Delaware of digital assets. And I think as most folks probably are aware, Delaware has a very favorable corporate law treatment. That's why a lot of most companies in the US are incorporated in Delaware. And so Wyoming has passed a number of laws favorable to the digital asset industry, including the creation of a new state banking charter specifically to serve crypto banks or cryptocurrency firms, which, a lot of them have a hard time accessing a traditional banking relationship because banks are kind of scared to deal with these companies. In addition, Wyoming has created recognized DAOs as a legal entity. So distributed decentralized autonomous organizations. So that's recognized in state law as a unique legal entity. And they've also clarified that for money transmission purposes, digital assets do not apply in that state as well. So, very much the complete opposite end of the spectrum from what New York did. And then, kind of most states are sort of in the middle of that right now. But you can imagine in the U.S. at least, if you're a state legislature, that's generally a part-time position. So you have a full-time job, and then the legislature meets periodically. These are folks that don't have the time or the expertise to become familiar with the nuance of blockchain technology and digital assets. And so they're hearing from lobbyists, about how great this is, about how it's going to increase tax revenue and create jobs and do all these things in the state. And, there's no one in, the opposite end, saying, okay, wait a second, there's some risk here that we should be thinking about, right? I like to joke that academia is really the only place you can get paid to be a crypto skeptic. So, it's problematic from my standpoint, and you're starting to see the crypto industry really get their way at the state level. They've had less success in DC. Largely, I think, because the financial crisis is still fresh enough in many people's minds on Capitol Hill, and they see some of the parallels. But at the state level, they're really having some success.
This is interesting because we see in the US, this is not so different than in the EU. Wyoming can be compared as Estonia or Malta, potentially, when New York can be compared to Germany or France. And we do have the same issue at the end, i.e., where before having this unique regulation or directive in the EU, when it is not regulated, each country has its own regulation, and we see the same topics than you. This is interesting. No, what do you think, Faustine?
Yeah, that's very interesting. Also the huge difference as maybe but in France we set a regulatory regime for both issuers and crypto asset service providers in 2019, so before any crisis, anything, I would say, and that France is currently leading, inspiring the European framework because of this very early achievements. I want to remind that in France, this regulation, even if it was really early compared with other member states in Europe and even before an harmonized regime, it was a good news for the industry. It was really welcomed by companies who needed this regulation to be able to be taken seriously and to be distinguished as credible and virtuous actors compared with other. At a time when there is no regulation, it's quite easy for opportunistic people to enjoy this innovation. So this is the same in Europe right now, but the difference is that it's even better news for French companies, but also some others, because not only France has a regulatory regime, but it will finally harmonize the rules between all the companies in the Europe. So that's very important right now to have this European regulation. But we are talking a lot about regulation, but we should also talk about supervision, because setting a regulation, if we do not have the adequate and ready supervision to ensure that there is a fair application between members, it will be very detrimental to this virtuous industry that will play the rules of the EU game, and that won't be able to compete with others that don't want and could be not prevented to do so by enough supervision. So I wanted to introduce this topic because sure, regulation is necessary, and I said if it is adapted and proportionate, but we also need supervision. And that's something that in France we experienced, having an early regulation that doesn't go with the appropriate supervision. And at the end, we are penalizing companies that play the rules despite others. And this goes against all the objectives that we are trying to achieve with regulations.
Maybe just to go back on what Lee said about Congressman education about these topics, do you think that members of the parliaments, members of the people working in the Commission, people working in the European Council have at least enough education about these topics to do the regulation, or maybe there are some blind spots that they don't fully master yet? I don't know, Faustine, if you want to start maybe, or Hubert.
Yeah, I can start. I think, as I said, because France started really early to think about the regulation of crypto assets, we do have really good experts within regulators and even within our government. But the innovation is really going really fast, and even when you are 200% involved in the industry, it's not quite easy to follow this innovation, and it's understandable. And I think that it's not what we expect also from the EU legislators to be crypto experts, but we do expect that they get enough information and that they rely on the industry and the experts within the industry in those regulatory debates. So that I think this is the point. Even if I think we cannot expect to have crypto experts everywhere within European institutions, within national authorities, but we do expect that they get informed and that they get in touch with the sector when they are working on regulation that will impact them. I think it's really important because it's something that that needs to be improved. I think the contact and the relations between institutions and the crypto industry. And we are really promoting this dialogue to be restored at a time, as I said, where debates are going really fast, and that the implications for the sector will be really, really strong and potentially really, really harmful. And we could see examples where if institutions get to better know the sector, we wouldn't have been some rules that are not adapted. For example, at the very beginning, in the draft by the European Commission of MiCA, you could not provide services without having a legal entity, and it was prohibited. So when we asked if there was how can we let DeFi grow in this framework, it's just that they did not know about DeFi at all. So they drafted this regulation without knowing that DeFi existed, and so that they were prohibiting DeFi like this. So fortunately, it's a mistake that can be today solved. But that's a good example if we go too fast, and that if we don't get to better know the industry, because we cannot be crypto experts, it's very difficult. We can decide very harmful regulations for the sector.
And maybe that is something that we can learn from the American perspective, because as you said, Lee, there seems to be a much better dialogue between the industry and the major players and the institutions. Do you think that it's only because they have reached this size where they can afford to have people lobbying, being present in the right institutions, meeting the right persons?
Well, yeah, certainly. I mean, you have to have the resources to, to play the lobbying game for sure. I also think the crypto sector has learned lessons from the tech sector that came before them and their approach to DC, which was very much dismissive, hands off. And of course, we've since seen, a pretty significant, big tech backlash, and of course, in the EU. As well. And so, I think the digital asset sector recognizes that, the earlier you are in the room with policymakers and having these conversations, the better the outcome it'll be for them. Now, of course, I question whether or not it'll be the best outcome for society as a whole. But that's a separate separate debate. And so, you've seen, again, I'll bring up the example of Sam Bankman-Fried, the CEO of FTX, who is a very visible presence in Washington, D.C., and not just meeting with, senators or congressmen, but actually meeting with commissioners at, various regulatory agencies, which, this is on paper, or I guess on the blockchain, at least, a billionaire. And so, it's hard to imagine someone like Jeff Bezos, for instance, meeting with a CFTC commissioner or an SEC commissioner. So it's a very much a strategic approach, for sure. And of course, they have their allies on Capitol Hill as well. I mean, there's a blockchain caucus at this point. It's pretty bipartisan. I think the crypto sector is very much striving to remain bipartisan now in this polarized environment. I do wonder if it's possible for anything to be bipartisan. It certainly seems as though Republicans at this point are kind of much all in on crypto, minus President Trump, actually, who's repeatedly been very skeptical and dismissive of cryptocurrency, but the party hasn't fallen in line. And Democrats are kind of all over the place, frankly, when it comes to digital assets. So, I think the lesson, again, that the sector has learned is to engage early, and we'll see if that works for them long term.
Very interesting to see the differences on this side. I don't know if there's some comments on this way of working on the American side. So we spoke about the content, and maybe when you just go back on the stage of the process regarding the regulation. So as Faustine mentioned, it's going very fast in Europe. Could you maybe explain us a bit more why, and if there a sort of deadline for this text, and then maybe we can ask Lee where it is and what are the next steps for the American products.
Yes, sure. So maybe just to remind you, the first MiCA draft was published by the European Commission in September 2020. And few days ago, we just entered the trialogue between the European institutions, so nearly 2 years after. This means that in this trialogue phase, both the Parliament, the Council, and the European Commission must discuss to find a consensus on the final version of a MiCA regulation. And what happened is that Europe wanted to synchronize debates on MiCA with another piece of regulation, which is the review of transfer of funds, which is a regulation of 2015 first, but that being reviewed in the context of a big review of the IMS CFT framework in Europe. But this TFR, the first draft TFR regulation was published in July 2021, so nearly 1 year after MiCA. But there is a will in Europe to finalize those two pieces of regulation at the same time before summer. Why is to try to implement those two texts and to ask crypto markets in Europe to comply with those two texts at the same time, which could be if we assume that we have a final MiCA and TFR regulations before summer, it could be in 2023, 2024 maximum. So that's why the trialogue phase is really fast, because in other regulation, those trialogue phases could last years actually. So if we say that it started in April and ended in July, it's a really fast trialogue period that we are living, meaning that we have a small rooms of improvements of those texts too. So it's really a will from the French presidency of the EU mainly to achieve, to find consensus on those two texts before summer. And then the industry will need to get prepared in the, let's say, 18-24 months after this entry into force.
And maybe Lee, on the American side, what do you think are the next steps? Are there an agenda with clear dates and some deadlines, or nothing at all?
No, I mean, I really think it's going to be the status quo for a while in the US. Now, again, we are waiting on the agencies to produce their reports that they were tasked with in the executive order. I think the one area where you actually might see Congress act in is when it comes to stable coins. So there was a government report in the fall that called for Congress to pass a law requiring most stablecoin issuers, or at least fiat-backed stablecoin issuers, to become FDIC insured banks, so that they would, address the run risk that I alluded to earlier. So there's a bill in Congress that would do that. Last week in the Senate Ag Committee, I believe there was a bill that was introduced that would give the Commodity Futures Trading Commission oversight over crypto spot markets. We'll see if that goes anywhere. But otherwise, I think we're just going to be, muddling through really. And the industry would like to say that it's going to be, continuation of regulation by enforcement. No, I just call it enforcing the law. But this morning, actually, the SEC just announced that they added 20 staff members to their crypto enforcement division. The SEC chair, Gary Gensler, has been, warning cryptocurrency issuers as well as trading platforms that they're likely dealing in securities and need to register. And so I think, his kind of patience has worn thin. And I definitely expect you'll see an uptick in cryptocurrency enforcement questions or in enforcement actions. As to the question in the chat on the Ripple lawsuit, this is ongoing. So the SEC sued Ripple and two of its executives in December of 2020. So this was actually under the former SEC chairman, Jay Clayton, for conducting an unregistered securities offering of their token XRP. Ripple is waging a very aggressive legal campaign. They've hired some very powerful lawyers to help them, including the former SEC chair, Mary Jo White. And I don't know how that will play out. Of course, it's going to be a critical decision. I mean, I will note that the SEC thus far is undefeated when it comes to crypto enforcement actions. Now, most of these do settle, right? But they have yet to lose a case. And so I think given that track record, which is something like 94, 95, and 0, I do expect ultimately they will prevail in the Ripple litigation as well. If they don't, it's really going to be dragged back to the drawing board in terms of which of these coins are securities or not. And I think it'll really become the Wild West. So time will tell.
Okay. So we see that there are really two different stages. So the American project is rather early, where the European one is very advanced. So I would just like to go back to what Commissioner McGuinness said. And I have a quick question for all of you. Do you think that it will be possible, it could be possible, that the European Union and the US work together on a joint crypto playbook, or we will have two different set of rules? Yeah, we'll just start with this question. Do you think there will be one joint playbook or two different set of rules? Maybe Hubert, you can start.
Yes, I think it is two different because the definition of securities in the US is quite far to the definition of financial instrument in the EU, and this is one of the main points, because we cannot have the same regulation. And by the way, we don't have any global regulation for securities nor for commodities. What is new in this industry is that we do have global platform working around the world every day. When on the securities market, it's still a local regulation or regional regulation with local exchanges. We don't see any global stock exchange. It doesn't exist at all. This is why we don't need a global securities regulation, because it's still a local and regional regulation. And the challenge for the regulator with the digital assets and the digital asset platforms is those players are working globally in the world with different regulation. And this is why, in theory, yes, it could be better to have a unique and global regulation. But I think it is too far due to the difference of approach and the difference of definition between securities and financial instruments, with a lot of other definitions. It is, I don't know if it is needed, but it is a global challenge, because again, those players are for once global in one sense, playing with local regulation. Let's take an example. About derivatives. In the EU, we do have a regulation, which is the MiFID one, when you are providing a derivative, you must be regulated as an investment firm, and specifically MTF, multilateral trading platform, if you are a platform. Okay, this is for the EU. Let's take Kraken, Binance, or Coinbase. If they are regulated as an MTF in the EU, how they should be regulated in the US with US regulation? But how it is possible to have one order book, one global order book with different regulation, with the CFTC, for instance, and with the EU in the other hand? It doesn't work.
Thank you. Very clear.
Yeah, I mean, maybe to add to that point, generally agree with Hubert. I mean, digital assets touch on, so many different things. So I don't think it's realistic to expect there to be, international or even just EU, US harmonization when it comes to all aspects of crypto. But I think there are some areas where you can see that, notably in the money laundering and terrorist financing context. And so, the EU and EU member states are members of the Financial Action Task Force, as is the US. And the Financial Action Task Force has released guidance when it comes to virtual asset service providers The U.S. is largely in compliance. My understanding is that the EU is in the process of creating an EU-wide, financial intelligence unit. Hubert, it can probably clarify that better than I can. And so I think that's one area where you can see harmonization. I think another is in the banking sector when it comes to how traditional and regulated banks are engaging in digital asset activity. And so historically, the Basel Committee on Banking Supervision, within the BIS is where countries get together and harmonize, common standards for bank regulation and bank supervision. So we're currently operating under Basel III rules in both countries. I think that's something that I know the Basel Committee is looking at and has actually put out a draft regulation there. So there are some aspects of digital assets where I do think you will see greater convergence and development of common standards, but probably not in the securities regulation spaces Hubert alluded to.
Indeed, and maybe Faustine, if you have some elements to shed light on this question too.
I actually agree with what has been said. So no, I don't have any useful elements to add.
No problem.
To take questions for the time.
Yeah, exactly. So we'll start the last part of this conversation, which is the questions from the audience. So really feel free to send all your questions in the chat. We have one right now here. So we've seen that in Europe it was a lot about regulation, but we didn't talk a lot about standards. Do you think that there's maybe a missed opportunity here where we should have first started by thinking about standards that the industry would have adopted, and these standards would have been virtuous enough and not to require a harsh regulation on the different players? So I don't know, or on the American side, do you think that we can see standards? Well, do we see some standards in the industry, or we don't see any at all, and that's why regulation is required? If maybe I wasn't clear, sorry. So let's start again. So maybe let's start on the European side. Do you think that the regulation is necessary right now because there's no standards that have been set by private actors, for example, showing that there's enough security for the consumer, that there's enough transparency with law enforcement, and because there's no standards, people had to regulate and enforce some laws?
If I can start with the French perspective, as I said, we had a regulation for crypto markets for a long time now. So I don't think at the stage of maturity of the industry, the companies had time to think about standards because of this regulation which come very soon. But I think from the for a long time, if not regulatory standards, I think the industry really strive to show what's different thanks to the technology in terms of transparency, security, and the opportunities of those technologies. But not, I would say on the technological side, but not on the regulatory side. For a long time, there is a very lots of efforts in terms of education to make understand the opportunities. And in France, it was the regulation came really soon to think about self-regulation.
Okay, very clear. So we don't have questions yet. So if some pops into mind for our attendees, please write them down. So maybe I have a question. So we talked a lot about two projects. We talked about the European one and we talked about the American one. But is there a third one maybe that could be another way to handle this industry? So we talked a bit about Switzerland maybe being a third model. Could you maybe please give us some details about the differences of this third way of doing compared to the European one and compared to the American one? Hubert, maybe you want to start with this one?
Yes, I'm not an expert at all on the Swiss law, nor a Swiss lawyer. Which is interesting to see is the Switzerland is viewed as very proactive and friendly space for crypto asset players, which is true, but not totally. As usual, if you look about the situation with the banks, it is more or less the same that in the EU. It is difficult to open a bank account if you are in the crypto world. Then seeing that if we put away the question of the tax, if you put away the question of the governance with the foundations in Switzerland for some protocols, and if we focus only on the regulation itself, Switzerland was one of the first countries to issue guidelines concerning cryptos, which is true, with interesting distinction between, as you may recall, the different taxonomy on the cryptos. But we don't see any major evolution of the regulation as a hard or a strong regulation as we will have in the EU. Then the regulation comes more from the EAML, as Lee said before, and the fact that Switzerland, as part of the FETF, is obliged to introduce all the recommendations from the FETF. But how do you say that? One of the issues that I see in my experience with Switzerland is it depends what do you want to do in Switzerland. If you want to implement your activity for Europe in Switzerland, okay, but you are limited to Switzerland because Switzerland is not part of the EU. And you cannot offer your activity in the EU. This is the case for any activity in Switzerland. If you are a bank or if you are an asset manager, you cannot offer your product in the EU because Switzerland is not within the EU. As you may be know that the discussion between the EU Commission and Bern in Switzerland has been stopped at the demand of the Swiss, and we don't have any idea how it will start to enter in within the EU regulation, or at least to enter into the EU framework. What I am trying to say is it was a good start for Switzerland. It's still a good location for some activities, as the issuance of NFT or as the issuance of for ICO and others. But if you want to be a EU player as a platform or as a global platform, you still be limited as any other activity in Switzerland. And in my view, they don't have something similar than the MiCA regulation. At the opposite, they have enacted quite recently an interesting law that we do have in France too, concerning the securities token, which is very innovative as a French one too, in a different approach. But concerning again the digital assets, not the security token, I don't see any major evolution as we do have as MiCA. Faustine, maybe you have another view. I don't. No.
No, you're right. I think Switzerland gets to be famous for its taxonomy, which inspired lots of debates then and for being really innovative, friendly as a whole. But regarding regulation, I don't think that there is anything anything new and particular to say.
Okay. And maybe Lee, if you want to answer this question about Switzerland, maybe differences with the American project and the European one, and after we can also cover a question that is specifically addressed to you in the chat.
Yeah, I mean, so, you know, Switzerland and some other jurisdictions, I think notably Singapore, have attempted to provide some definitional clarity around what these tokens are. And so I think, you know, Hubert did a good job, but just to kind of summarize, you know, they clarify, you know, when is a token an investment token, when is it a payment token, and when is it a utility token? And then, you know, depending on which category it falls in, there's a fairly clear regulatory regime. In the context of utility tokens, there really is no, you know, regulation, because the token is designed to be, you know, redeemed for some good or some service, you know, on the blockchain. You know, there are other ways to get at this. I mean, the U.S. is kind of stuck in this, you know, is it a security? Is it a commodity? You know, SEC Chair Gensler has you know, said that most of these exchanges are offering securities. You know, I think it's worth highlighting what Canada has done, because in Canada they've created this, the securities regulators there have created this definition called a crypto contract. And that brings these exchanges, you know, like Gemini and Coinbase, into the securities regulatory perimeter. And I don't think most people realize that when you trade on a crypto exchange like Coinbase, for instance, let's say you buy Bitcoin, there isn't actually a corresponding transaction recording that on the blockchain. Coinbase is simply trading out of their own account. So they're maintaining a ledger, a database, just like a bank is. And so what Canada has said is that, well, that represents a contract, a crypto contract between the user of the platform and the platform itself, regardless of, you know, whatever they're buying. It even may be a commodity or not be a security, but it doesn't matter, because there's a legal relationship there between the platform and the user. And it's really kind of enshrining in the law this whole notion of not your keys, not your coin, right? I mean, if someone else has your private keys, you don't have custody. You know, someone else has custody for you. So so I think that's something that you know, other countries, Canada's the only one who's implemented that, but it seems to make sense to me. In terms of the property law question, I really haven't heard that come up in U.S. courtrooms. So you know, I'm not all that familiar with that line of reasoning. So I'll just say that I haven't really heard that. I guess that maybe another question was around insights about coming regulation in emerging countries. You know, frankly, I don't. I mean, I think they are looking to countries that are considered more friendly to the crypto industry. Again, you know, they want to compete for jobs and tax revenue and all those things. So I certainly think, you know, they're going to try to provide that definitional clarity that Switzerland has done. But of course, that needs to correspond too with you know, a pretty clear supervisory regime, as we touched on.
Maybe this question is pretty interesting. And Faustine, would you have some insights maybe on emerging countries setting some regulations that are really different from economies like European ones or the American one?
I think that they cannot be at the same maturity stage in terms of regulation than the EU. So what we can see is first steps regarding regulation. It can be in some countries a mere prohibition of crypto assets, of services to be provided, of ICOs, whatever the form is. and it can also be, to the contrary, to raise the legal uncertainty regarding the possible use by citizens of crypto assets. So just to clarify this regarding users, where it can be still quite unclear whether what are crypto assets and whether they are legal or not. But I'm not really aware of all the regulation developments abroad. Maybe Hubert is more aware than me. So maybe Hubert, do you have additional information that I don't have?
Things that I have mentioned in the chat concerning Morocco, Dubai, and Oman, at least. Oman in Dubai this is interesting because they try to attract in the Middle East. They want to be the Switzerland from the Middle East, including for digital assets, and they do have some regulation which are quite different than the EU, which is interesting. At least for Dubai, because Oman is quite early, too early to have an idea because the process is just engaged. Morocco, as Morocco is close to the EU concerning a lot of international treaties, they have to be close to the EU regulation. And for me, the Moroccan regulation will be more flexible than the MiCA one, but close to the MiCA. It will be a MiCA regulation which is understable, if I may, which is not the case for the MiCA as of today. If you don't, if you are not an expert in Asia, I have no idea.
Okay, very clear. And maybe the last question for our webcast. So it's a question about the OECD public consultation on crypto asset reporting framework and amendments to the common reporting standard. So pretty technical question. I don't know if one of you maybe have a comment or a feedback on this framework.
I have to admit that I'm not, all that familiar with that specific consultation. I mean, I can tell you that, issues around taxation are very much, front and center. I'm assuming that, given the OECD's historical focus on taxation, that's what the consultation is in reference to. But here in the US, when the Senate was negotiating the infrastructure bill, which eventually was signed into law and is, President Biden's, signature legislative achievement thus far, there was a seemingly arcane provision inserted into the bill that would impose tax reporting obligations on, brokers in the cryptocurrency context. So, I think those of you who use, an online stock, retail brokerage like, Schwab or TD Ameritrade or what have you, Robinhood, at the end of the year that you get a 1099 that discloses, what your tax gains and losses were. Well, there was no similar obligation that was imposed on these crypto trading platforms, and so that was something that the industry fought tooth and nail against for a variety of reasons. Ultimately, they were unsuccessful. And so, I do think that there's widespread recognition that there is rampant underreporting in the cryptocurrency taxation context. And I think that's probably another area where you actually would see some more multilateral coordination.
Okay. Maybe to conclude, if each one of you could just quickly say maybe the key elements that we did not have the time to discuss, so that maybe our attendees can have a look at them after this webcast, and also maybe showing what our attendees should really pay attention to keep up to date with the regulations and see in which direction they are going. So I don't know who wants to start maybe on this one.
I'd say one thing we kind of hinted at but didn't really talk about is central bank digital currencies. I think this is definitely something to keep an eye essentially every major central bank at this point is considering doing a CBDC. Now, in the US, it's very early stages. It's in kind of the research, brainstorm phase. Of course, other jurisdictions are piloting or rolling out a CBDC. Of course, China with digital yuan. And so, I think you're going to continue to see more countries turn to CBDC to help, deal with some of these persistent, financial inclusion issues. So definitely something to keep an eye on.
Maybe something that we did not have time to talk about, but that will be key in the EU debates is the question of the environmental impact of crypto assets. There were really hot debates, especially in February and March, with an adoption by the Parliament of the best option. That's what we think at the best option for the sector, but it doesn't mean that debates are closed on this topic. I think to the contrary, that it will still be a very important issue to be discussed in this MiCA, but maybe in also further MiCA, and that we really need to pay attention to this topic too. And if to keep abreast of the debate, we are trying to keep the ecosystem abreast of those evolutions. So don't hesitate to see our position papers on Adan's website, but also to see all the news on our social networks if you're really interested in following what we're building right now.
So Hubert, you have the last word.
Yeah, and I will finish as I have started with reference to the Unidroit draft project, which is interesting on the substance for the digital assets. And you can see on the chat the link to the project. Nothing more.
Well, thank you very much, all three of you, for the time you spent with us and for your very clear explanations on this pretty technical subject. To all our attendees, thank you also for joining us and sharing your questions. It will be our pleasure to receive your questions, so do not hesitate to send them to the address that briefed you about this webcast. And so we will continue to really have a close look at what is happening in this field and what tools public authorities set up for this technology. So as Faustine said, you can have a close look at Adan, but also the Human Technology Foundation will be publishing something soon enough. Thank you very much for all of you, and I hope you have a nice evening for the Europeans and a nice afternoon for our American friends. Goodbye.
Thank you. Goodbye.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.